In 1920, the United States government did something no modern democracy had ever attempted. It banned alcohol entirely, not taxed it, not regulated it, banned it completely, nationally, with a constitutional amendment. 13 years later, the government reversed the ban, admitted it had failed, and quietly handed the liquor industry back to private hands. The cost of that experiment: thousands dead from poisoned bootleg spirits, organized crime entrenched in every major American city, and a federal government so discredited that historians still study it as one of the greatest policy failures in history. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Alcohol had already survived bans, wars, plagues, and the collapse of entire civilizations long before Prohibition tried to stop it. Because alcohol is not just a drink, it is older than writing, older than farming, older than the wheel, and the story of how it shaped every empire, every revolution, and every modern health crisis on Earth is one of the most consequential stories never properly told. The story starts not with a brewery or a vineyard. It starts with fruit rotting on the ground. Long before any human deliberately made alcohol, our earliest ancestors almost certainly encountered it by accident. Overripe fruit ferments naturally when wild yeast in the air contacts its sugars. Primates have been observed deliberately seeking out fermented fruit in the wild. Some researchers believe the preference for the sweet, slightly intoxicating taste of fermented fruit is literally coded into primate biology, including ours. The oldest confirmed chemical evidence of deliberately produced alcohol dates to around 7000 BC in China. Archaeologists found clay jars in the village of Jiahu containing residue from a fermented mixture of rice, honey, and fruit. Someone made that drink on purpose. Someone stored it. Someone came back for more. Around the same time, in the ancient Near East, something remarkable was happening with grain. For decades, archaeologists assumed that humans first cultivated grain to make bread. The bread-first theory was tidy and logical. People needed food, so they grew grain, so they made bread. Then the evidence started pointing somewhere more complicated. Several scholars now argue that the drive to produce fermented grain drinks, essentially early beer, may have been one of the primary motivations for the agricultural revolution itself. The oldest known brewery, discovered at a site called Rakefit Cave in Israel, dates to roughly 13,000 years ago, predating settled agriculture by thousands of years. Think about what that means. Humans may have started farming not primarily to eat, but to drink. By 3000 BC, alcohol was not just a beverage in the ancient world. It was money. In ancient Egypt, workers who built the pyramids were paid partly in beer. Archaeological records show laborers received a daily ration of about 4 to 5 liters of beer per day. This was not a fringe benefit, it was a core part of their compensation, a caloric staple, a social ritual, and a marker of the transaction between worker and state. Egyptian beer was thick, nutritious, and lower in alcohol than modern beer. It was closer to liquid bread than what we drink today. Doctors prescribed it, priests offered it to the gods, pharaohs were buried with it. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians had already been brewing beer for over 1,000 years by this point. They had a goddess of beer, Ninkasi, and they wrote her a hymn that doubles as the world's oldest known recipe. The hymn describes in precise detail how to make beer from twice-baked bread, water, and fermented grain. It was written down because the recipe mattered, because beer mattered that much. Wine was developing along a parallel track. The earliest evidence of wine production comes from the South Caucasus region, modern-day Georgia, and Armenia, around 6000 BC. From there, viticulture spread west through the Middle East and into the Mediterranean. By the time ancient Greece and Rome rose to power, wine had become something else entirely. It had become civilization itself. The Greeks did not just drink wine, they built a philosophy around it. The symposium, the foundation of Greek intellectual culture, was a structured drinking event. Men gathered, mixed wine with water in a large vessel called a crater, and spent the evening in debate, poetry, and political discussion. Plato's most famous works are set at symposia. The drinking was the point. It loosened tongues, opened minds, and created the social conditions under which ideas could be tested and argued. Wine was always diluted with water in ancient Greece. Drinking wine undiluted was considered barbaric, literally the behavior of non-Greeks. The ratio of water to wine was a marker of civilization itself. Rome took wine further than anyone. At the height of the Roman Empire, wine was consumed at every level of society, from senators to slaves. Roman soldiers received a daily wine ration called posca, a mixture of vinegar and water that was more hygienic than the local water supply in most of the territories they occupied. Wine was safer to drink than water. That single fact shaped consumption patterns for centuries. Rum planted vineyards across every territory it conquered. Gaul, Iberia, North Africa, Britain. Wherever Roman legions went, grapevines followed. The wine regions of France, Spain, and Portugal exist today in large part because Roman colonists planted them 2,000 years ago. When the Roman Empire began to collapse in the 4th and 5th centuries, it was the Christian church that preserved wine culture. Wine was not optional for the church, it was sacramental. The Eucharist required it. Monasteries across Europe became the primary centers of viticulture through the Dark Ages, carefully tending vineyards when the political structures around them were disintegrating. Monks in Burgundy, Bordeaux, and the Rhine Valley developed techniques for identifying the best plots of land, the best grape varieties, the best fermentation methods. The great wine regions of Europe were largely mapped by monks. Here is a historical irony that most people never learn. The process that created whiskey, vodka, brandy, and gin was invented in the Islamic world, where alcohol is religiously forbidden. Arab chemists during the Islamic Golden Age between roughly the 8th and 13th centuries developed and refined the alembic still. They were not trying to make stronger alcohol. They were distilling rose water, perfumes, and medicines, but the process they perfected, heating a liquid to create vapor, and then condensing that vapor back into a more concentrated liquid, was the exact technology that would later be applied to fermented drinks to create distilled spirits. The word alcohol itself comes from the Arabic alcohol, originally referring to a finely distilled powder used as eye makeup, later extended to any purified distillate. When European scholars translated Arabic scientific texts in the 12th and 13th centuries, distillation technology crossed into Christian Europe. Alchemists and physicians in Italy and Germany began experimenting almost immediately. By the 1300s, distilled spirits were being produced in European monasteries, again framed as medicine. Aqua vitae, the water of life, that is what they called early distilled spirits. The same phrase appears independently in Gaelic as Usi Beatha, which eventually became the word whiskey, water of life. Every culture that encountered distillation concluded the same thing. This substance was something extraordinary, something beyond ordinary drink. They were right, and that was the beginning of a much more complicated story. When European powers began colonizing the Americas in the 1500s, they brought alcohol with them as a tool. Wine and brandy were traded with indigenous populations who had no prior exposure to distilled spirits and no cultural frameworks for managing them. The consequences were devastating and in many cases deliberately exploited. But rum is where alcohol's history turns darkest. Rum was born on Caribbean sugar plantations in the mid-160s. Molasses, the thick black byproduct of sugar refining, had been considered waste. Someone discovered it could be fermented and distilled into a potent, cheap spirit. Rum was born. The timing was not coincidental. The same plantation system built on enslaved African labor that was producing sugar was now also producing the raw material for rum. Rum became woven into the transatlantic slave trade in ways that are almost impossible to separate. New England merchants developed what historians call the triangle trade in spirits. They imported molasses from Caribbean sugar plantations, distilled it into rum in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, shipped the rum to West Africa, where it was traded for enslaved people, and then transported those enslaved people to Caribbean plantations, where they produced more molasses. Rum funded slave ships. Rum was used to negotiate with African intermediaries who sold enslaved people to European traders. Rum flowed through every corner of the system. By the mid-1700s, New England alone had over 150 rum distilleries. It was the most consumed spirit in colonial America. The economic engine of the early Atlantic world ran partly on rum money. While rum was crossing oceans, something was happening inside Britain that would become the first modern public health crisis linked to alcohol. Gin had arrived. Dutch soldiers had been drinking a crude juniper-flavored spirit, called Geneva for decades before British troops encountered it during wars in the Netherlands in the late 1600s. They brought the taste for it home. British distillers began producing their own version. Then the government made a catastrophic mistake. In 1690, Parliament passed legislation that effectively deregulated gin production in England. Almost anyone could distill it. No license was needed. Grain surpluses from English landowners needed a market, and gin provided one. The government taxed imported French brandy while leaving domestic gin nearly untouched. Within a generation, gin consumption in England exploded. London in the 1720s and 1730s was in the grip of what historians call the gin craze. Estimates suggest that London's population of about 600,000 people was consuming over 11 million gallons of gin per year. That is roughly 14 gallons per person per year, including children. Gin was cheaper than bread, cheaper than beer. It was sold from wheelbarrows, out of windows in back alleys. William Hogarth's famous 17051 engraving, Gin Lane, depicted emaciated mothers dropping infants, corpses in the street, and a city dissolving into madness. It was propaganda, but it was grounded in a real crisis. Death rates in London rose. Infant mortality climbed. Workhouses filled. Parliament eventually passed a series of gin acts throughout the 1730s, 40s, and 50s, tightening regulation, raising taxes, restricting sales. The gin craze gradually subsided, but it left something behind: a template, a warning, and a question that societies have struggled with ever since. When alcohol becomes cheap enough for the poorest people to consume in unlimited quantities, what happens? The answer was already written in London's streets, and nobody learned from it. The Industrial Revolution did not reduce alcohol consumption, it industrialized it. Steam-powered distilleries could produce spirits at a scale and consistency impossible by hand. Railroads distributed bottled alcohol to every corner of the country within days instead of weeks. Glass-making improvements meant bottled beer could be standardized, branded, and mass-marketed, and the workers who ran the factories drank heavily. Early industrial Britain had a pub on what seemed like every corner because pubs served a function beyond drinking. In cities where working-class housing was overcrowded and grim, the pub was the living room. It was warm. It was social. It was one of the few places a working man could sit for hours without being moved along. Employers initially tolerated and sometimes even encouraged drinking. Factory owners in some industries paid wages on Saturday nights at pubs, specifically because workers would spend a portion immediately on drink, which flowed back to the economy. The employer participated in the temperance movement rose in direct response to this. Religious reformers, early feminists, and social campaigners began documenting the consequences of industrial-era drinking. Domestic violence, child poverty, men drinking their weekly wages before rent was paid. In the United States, the temperance movement gained extraordinary momentum through the 1800s. Carrie Nation became famous for walking into saloons with a hatchet and destroying them. The Women's Christian Temperance Union grew into one of the most powerful lobbying organizations in American history. By 1917, fueled by wartime anti-German sentiment, since most American breweries were German-owned, and the moral energy of the temperance movement, Congress passed the 18th Amendment. Prohibition was coming. On January 17, 1920, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors became illegal across the United States. The results were not what the reformers expected. Americans did not stop drinking. They drank differently. Speakeasies, illegal bars operating behind false fronts and locked doors, numbered in the tens of thousands in cities like New York and Chicago. Bootleggers built distribution networks that stretched across state lines. Organized crime, which had previously operated at the margins of American society, stepped into the vacuum and built empires. Al Capone's criminal organization was generating an estimated $60 million per year, the equivalent of nearly $1 billion today, primarily from illegal alcohol. The Chicago outfit, the New York crime families, and dozens of smaller organizations across the country all expanded dramatically during Prohibition. The violence was staggering. Gang wars over bootlegging territory killed hundreds. Law enforcement was corrupted at every level. Federal agents, judges, and politicians took bribes. But the deadliest consequence was what people drank. Without regulated production, bootleggers cut their spirits with everything imaginable. Industrial alcohol, which the government mandated be poisoned with toxic additives to prevent drinking, was re-distilled and sold anyway. Methanol-contaminated spirits caused blindness and death. The government's own poison program killed an estimated 10,000 Americans. By 1933, it was over. The 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition. The great moral experiment had produced organized crime, poisoned alcohol, mass corruption, and roughly the same amount of drinking as before. The lesson seemed obvious: banning a substance people deeply want does not eliminate it. It criminalizes it, poisons it, and hands it to criminals. It was a lesson that would be ignored again and again in the century that followed. This is the part of alcohol's history that should make you uncomfortable, because what happened next followed almost exactly the same playbook as sugar. By the mid-20th century, scientists were accumulating serious evidence about alcohol's addictive properties and long-term health consequences. Liver disease, cardiovascular damage, neurological deterioration, and cancer links were being documented in peer-reviewed literature. The alcohol industry responded the way the tobacco and sugar industries had responded before it. It funded research designed to muddy the water. It created front organizations that sounded like independent health bodies, but were funded by distillers and brewers. It lobbied against health warning labels for decades. It promoted the concept of responsible drinking not as a genuine public health message, but as a strategy to shift all responsibility onto individual consumers and away from the product itself. The term alcoholism, framing addiction as a personal disease rather than a product liability, became industry-convenient language. If drinking too much was a personal failing, then the industry bore no responsibility for designing and marketing products specifically engineered to maximize consumption and craving. Research published in 2017 by academics studying industry-funded alcohol research found a pattern almost identical to tobacco. Funding source predicted conclusions. Industry-funded studies were dramatically more likely to find no significant harm. The most striking recent example came in 2018, when the National Institutes of Health launched a large study into the health effects of moderate drinking. The study had been quietly funded in part by Anheuser-Busch InBev, Heineken, and other major alcohol companies. When the funding arrangements were exposed, the NIH shut the study down. The scientists involved had been in direct communication with industry representatives about study design. The tobacco playbook, the sugar playbook, the alcohol playbook create doubt. Fund-friendly science. Market heavily to the young, delay regulation for as long as possible. Today, the global alcohol industry generates over $1.6 trillion per year. It spends billions on marketing carefully calibrated to reach young people at the exact age when drinking habits form. Sports sponsorships, music festival partnerships, social media campaigns built around aspiration and belonging. The numbers behind this are stark. Alcohol is now the 7th leading risk factor for premature death and disability worldwide. It is directly linked to over 200 diseases and injury conditions. Globally, alcohol causes approximately 3 million deaths per year, more than HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and violence combined. In the United States, roughly 95,000 people die from alcohol-related causes annually. That makes it the 3rd leading preventable cause of death in the country. Yet alcohol advertising faces almost none of the restrictions placed on tobacco. Here is the detail that should stop you cold. There is no safe level of alcohol consumption, according to a landmark 2018 study published in The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious medical journals, which analyzed data from 195 countries. The study concluded that the safest level of alcohol consumption is 0. The backlash from the alcohol industry was immediate and well-funded. Counter-studies appeared. Headlines emphasized the supposed heart benefits of red wine. The industry promoted the Mediterranean diet narrative, which includes wine, as evidence that moderate drinking was not only safe but beneficial. But the original data was not overturned. It was buried under noise. The average person on Earth now consumes about 6.4 liters of pure alcohol per year. In the United States and across much of Europe, that number is significantly higher. Young people in many countries are drinking more than any previous generation, partly because the industry has spent decades making alcohol synonymous with every social ritual that matters: celebration, grief, romance, friendship, success, and failure. Alcohol is the only drug in most Western societies where not consuming it requires a social explanation. Think about that. You never have to explain why you don't smoke. You never have to explain why you don't take painkillers recreationally. But in most social settings, not drinking alcohol invites immediate curiosity, pressure, and suspicion. The industry built that culture deliberately. Over decades, with billions of dollars, alcohol's story spans 13,000 years, every continent on Earth, and virtually every society humans have ever built. It was in the clay jars of Jiahu. It built the symposia where democracy was debated. It funded Roman legions and plantation slave ships. It fueled revolutions and survived bans that destroyed everything around them. It created the modern organized crime network. It buried its own health research. And it is sitting at your dinner table right now, at the bar you walked past, in the sports game you watched last weekend, marketed to you as something you need to belong. A drink first discovered in rotting fruit on a jungle floor became the most universally consumed psychoactive substance in human history. It toppled empires, it built fortunes, it destroyed families. And most people who drink it tonight will not think about any of this. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind everyday things. We have got a lot more coming.